Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful morning. It's wonderful to be back, especially after my trip to Israel. And I think that we can talk about this very powerful time in our calendar and also my trip. So, starting this past Tuesday, which was the 17th of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, there began a period that is called the 3 weeks. It's a time which Jews mourn the destruction of the Holy Temple, actually, both Holy Temples. This period is also historically marked times when the Jewish people were faced with difficult decisions, when it was hard to know what's the right thing to do. So I'll give you a little bit of the backstory, and then I want to transpose it onto the current situation. There's a Talmudic story. It's actually become quite famous about the era of the destruction of the temple. The Talmud, it's in Tractate Gittin, page 55b, if you want to look it up. It tells us that Jerusalem was destroyed because of Kamtza and Bar-Kamtza. So here's how the story goes. There was a wealthy man in Jerusalem who threw a lavish party, a beautiful dinner, and he gave his butler a list of guests to be invited to this dinner. Now, among these guests was one individual by the name of Kamsa. The butler was really busy with inviting all of the hotshots of the community and made a mistake. Instead of inviting Kamsa, he accidentally invited someone else with a very similar name. His name was Bar-Kamtza. The problem was that Bar-Kamtza was in some kind of feud with the host of this party. So when Bar-Kamtza got the invitation, he was elated. He thought that this host, this wealthy man in Jerusalem, wanted to make up with him and turn over a new leaf. So filled with enthusiasm, he comes to the party. He sits down at one of the tables. Now, into the social hall comes the beaming host. He starts going from table to table, toasting his guests, and suddenly he sees his enemy, Bar-Kamtza, sitting at this party. The host gets enraged. He says, Bar-Kamtza, aren't you my enemy? What are you doing here? Get out of here. Bar-Kamtza says, well, once I've already come, I'm already here. Let me stay, and I'll pay you whatever my meal costs. He's enraged. No, get out. Bar-Kamtza is humiliated in front of all these people. He offers to pay for half the entire party, as long as the host doesn't embarrass him in public. He again refuses. Get out. So Bar-Kamtza goes even further. He says, I will pay the cost of the entire party. Just don't humiliate me. And the host can't even accept this. But Talmud tells us that he took his hand, he stood him up, and he threw him out of the party. He simply threw him out in front of everybody. The sages of Israel, all of the Jerusalem VIPs were at the party. All the who's who of the Jewish world of the time was at the party, and nobody said a word. Not a protest. Nothing. The Talmud continues that Bar-Kamtza said to himself, since the sages sat at the party and saw what happened and didn't protest, it means they're fine with this. I am going to inform on them to the Caesar. In his rage, Bar-Kamtza decided to take revenge not only against this man, not only against the sages, but against the entire Jewish people. According to the Talmud, Bar-Kamtza visited the Caesar and told him that the Jews have rebelled against you. You have a revolt on your hands. The Caesar asked Bar-Kamtza, what's your proof? How do you know? So Bar-Kamtza told him, send them an animal to be sacrificed in their temple and see if they sacrifice it. So the Caesar sent Bar-Kamtza with a 3-year-old calf. On the way to Jerusalem, Bar-Kamtza inflicts a wound on the calf. Now, according to Jewish law, only an unblemished animal can be sacrificed in the temple. But Bar-Kamtza put a small cut in the animal's eyelid, which most people wouldn't consider a blemish in the first place. But understandably, once Bar-Kamtza got to the temple, a heated debate broke out amongst the Sanhedrin, which was the high court, the Supreme Court at the time, the Jewish Supreme Court. They didn't know what to do. The sages argued that the sacrifice must be brought for the purposes of keeping peace. It's the Caesar. Ordinarily, such a sacrifice would not be accepted, but now it could ignite a threat to our very lives. Who knows how the Caesar is going to react if he hears that his sacrifice was rejected? One of the sages present was a scholar. His name was Zechariah ben Avkalus. Apparently, he was one of the Sanhedrin's elders, the one that everyone respected. Now, Rabbi Zechariah joined the debate, and he argued that it's forbidden to bring the sacrifice because people will think that blemished animals are being sacrificed on the altar, which is an affront to God. Some of the sages there offered another suggestion to resolve the problem, but the fear was that Bar-Kamtza would inform on his own people, to the Caesar, that the sacrifice was not brought. Now, in Judaism, going back for many years, and you can understand through much persecution, there's such a thing as what's called a moser, an informer. If an individual is known to be snitching on the Jewish community to the authorities, and we're not talking about in our world today, we're talking about historically anti-Semitic authorities who, so many people during COVID were worried about this and that. And I remember speaking to a Holocaust survivor and said, nobody's going to kill you. When I was growing up in Europe, we were worried about people killing us just for being Jewish. Today, it's a whole different story. But historically, if somebody was an informer and they informed on the Jewish community to the authorities, it could mean that somebody was put to death. So the fact that they inform on the Jewish community is a clear and present danger, and they would be killed. No fair trial, no justice. That was what was done in those days. And in such cases, Jewish law rules that an informer is considered an aggressor and that it's permitted to kill him without any prior investigation. Maimonides actually writes about this in his injury laws. He says that it's permitted to kill an informer anywhere, even in our time. And it's a mitzvah to kill them. And whoever kills them first gets the mitzvah. This is how, again, I don't think we can relate to it as much because we don't have anything in our lives that presents such a danger. But throughout Jewish history, this was a very, very big deal for the Jewish community. So in light of that, there were sages who considered killing Bar-Kamtza to prevent him from reporting to the Caesar that the sacrifice was not brought. But Rabbi Zechariah said to them, people will think that someone who blemishes a sacrifice will get executed. And he didn't allow them to execute Bar-Kamtza. Ultimately, the Sanhedrin listened to Rabbi Zechariah, and they didn't offer the sacrifice, and they didn't execute Bar-Kamtza. Instead, Bar-Kamtza went to inform on his fellow Jews, and that resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple. The Caesar got upset, and he came, and Rome destroyed the Second Temple as a result of this. The Talmud says at the end of this whole saga, Rabbi Yochanan said, the humility of Rabbi Zechariah destroyed our house and burned our hall and exiled us from the land. Now, I heard this story when I was a child, and anything that you hear when you're a child, you have to, at some point in your adult life, re-look at it and re-examine it through the lens of adulthood. One of the things that I say about people's Jewish experiences, if you grew up in the Jewish community and you went to Hebrew school, if you don't continue learning Judaism as an adult, you will have a very elementary look at Judaism, which many people do because their Jewish education stops at, 10, 11, 12, 13, bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. And then what ends up happening is and when they look at this through adult eyes, it looks very elementary. It's actually one of the, I would say, the major issues with kids that are growing up in the Jewish community today is that they never have an opportunity to look at Judaism with their adult lens. My example is, imagine if all you knew about science was baking soda and vinegar and making volcanoes. I mean, there's a beautiful, incredible world of science, but if you look at it through a child's eyes, it's just baking soda and vinegar and making volcanoes. And so Judaism has that challenge for a lot of people. And so this story is a story that I had heard many times as a child. But as a child, I didn't understand Rabbi Yochanan's reaction to the story. Well, what does he mean by Rabbi Zechariah's humility? What was his humility? It actually seems just the opposite. He stood his ground with all his might. He didn't allow his colleagues to act against Jewish law by sacrificing a blemished animal on the altar. It would have made more sense for Rabbi Yochanan to say not Rabbi Zechariah's humility, but Rabbi Zechariah's zealousness. And secondly, and I would say most importantly, blaming the entire destruction of the Second Temple and the exile on Rabbi Zechariah's humility, to me, as an adult, looking at the story, it seems like a bit much. He only appears at the end of the story. And so what do you want from him? He wasn't the one who made Bar-Kamtza mad. It's a very sad story. He didn't create the issue. At worst, maybe you can say he was too rigid. Maybe because he was too rigid, because he didn't see the bigger picture, he indirectly caused the destruction. But to place all the blame upon Rabbi Zechariah, I think it's completely out of proportion. Didn't the sages themselves say the destruction of the Second Temple occurred because of baseless hatred? So why is the Talmud blaming Rabbi Zechariah for all the trouble? So this bothered me quite a bit this week. I don't know if it bothers you as much as it bothered me, but probably it bothers me more because I've been living with this as for many, many years and haven't really looked at it through the adult lens. And I found a really interesting midrash that sheds light on the entire saga. It's a midrash in Eicha, chapter 4, and it adds a very important detail there. Rabbi Zechariah was there. And Rabbi Zechariah, it says, could have protested, but he did not. The Midrash is referring not to the deliberations of the Sanhedrin of the Jewish Supreme Court, but to the party that we mentioned in the story before. The leading and most prominent sage that was sitting at the party with Kamtza and Bar-Kamtza, who could have protested, did not, and that was Rabbi Zachariah. If you go to Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, if you've never been there, it's for us living in this time, it's necessary. And it's the main museum is really special. But there's a number of other buildings on the Yad Vashem campus. And one of the buildings is a photo exhibit. It's a permanent display. You wouldn't know about it if you just went to the regular Yad Vashem building. You would have to, it's further into the campus. There's a building there that has all the files of every single survivor. If you want to go there and find family members, you can go into that building. There's computers there. There's files. There's library. It's like a librarian type place where you can actually find information about family. And there's this building where there's this photo exhibit. And there's a large picture there as you walk into the exhibit. I've spent hours analyzing this picture. It's a picture that was taken during a death march. I don't remember the city offhand. It was somewhere in Poland. And it was taken from a second floor of a building, and you can see the death march is going through a town square. And you can clearly see the victim. You can see the Jews who are walking in rows on this death march. You can clearly see the perpetrator. You see a bunch of Nazis in the front. May their name be erased. You see a bunch of Nazis in the middle. You see some in the back. You can see the perpetrators. But standing around, watching, onlookers, bystanders. There's hundreds of people watching. I've analyzed this picture. It's quite large, so you can even see some of the expressions on some of their faces. And I've wondered, the onlooker, the bystander, what is the responsibility of the person who just happened to be there? They had nothing to do with it. They have nothing to do with the story. I mean, they must have known that there was a concentration camp not far from them. If not, they probably were living under a rock. But they're sitting out on a random Thursday morning. I don't know what day of the week it was. They're sipping a coffee. Just imagine the scene. And they see a scene. Nazis in uniform, guns ablaze, and rows of Jews on a death march. What is that person's responsibility? As random bystanders, we're busy. We live such busy lives. Who has time for this? But what is our responsibility? What is our responsibility as carrying Jews living in the diaspora towards the people of Israel right now? Essentially, to a certain extent, we care and we do, and some of us at different levels, and many of us have really done our parts in our communities. And I'm not putting that down even a little bit. On behalf of the Jewish people, on behalf of the state of Israel, thank you for everything that you've done. But on a random Thursday morning, we're bystanders. It doesn't affect us on a day-to-day, or at least we don't think so. We're not living in Israel. Most of us haven't been there in quite a while. What's our responsibility? What's Rabbi Zachariah's responsibility? Just randomly sitting at an event. Was he to know that this episode that happened at a party was going to be the critical moment that turned the entire fate of the Jewish people for 2 millennia? That was the beginning of the saddest episode in Jewish history. Not the worst, but the saddest, because it changed. We went from a top of the world, the temple, Jerusalem, our homeland. We finally made it. We had been there. All of our dreams come true. All of the biblical promises come true. And then, in a matter of 3 weeks, the 17th of Tammuz, the Romans lay siege to Jerusalem. And 3 weeks later, on the 9th of Av, which will happen in just under 3 weeks, will be the saddest day in the Jewish calendar. The temple is destroyed. Both temples were destroyed on the same day of the Jewish calendar, the 9th of Av. And if you look at that day of the 9th of Av, hundreds of calamities have befallen the Jewish people, including the beginning of World War II, just as an example. Since that day, and since we were exiled from our homeland, at any celebration, we remember Jerusalem. In our prayers 3 times a day, we face Jerusalem and we remember Jerusalem. It's hard-pressed to think that there's somebody out there who, if you've been to any semblance of a Jewish wedding, you know the end of the wedding, the breaking of the glass. Do you know why we break the glass? Because even in our greatest celebration, the greatest celebration of our lives, our wedding, we should remember the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. That's why we break the glass. And there are so many different things that we do throughout the year, some on a daily basis, some annually, some just at certain moments in our lifetime. There's a tradition since that day that when you build a house, you leave a part of the house not finished to remember the destruction in Jerusalem. It changed. That moment changed Jewish history and the Jewish story forever. It's incredible. It's a miracle that here we are in our lifetime. We can get on a plane and just go. To me, it doesn't get old. Walking the streets of Jerusalem, every step, I can't help standing at the wall and praying. I don't cry so much, But there I cry, thinking of my great-great-grandparents and what they would have done for this moment. And here I am back in my lifetime, touching the wall, living a dream the Jewish people only dreamed for 2,000 years. And the question that I kept asking myself is, as a Jew in the 21st century, am I a victim? The Jewish people have been victims for so long. Am I a perpetrator? There's a lot of people who consider me a perpetrator, the aggressor. Because the Jewish people today are not weak at the knees. There's a strength, a physical strength that I saw not once, not twice, but 3 times in great displays during my time in Israel, just now. Or am I the diaspora Jew? Am I a bystander? Who am I? I couldn't help but keep on thinking about this. And it's amazing that this is exactly the question of this time during the 3 weeks. I'll tell you one example. And there's so many that I can share. I was in Jerusalem for Shabbat. And I haven't been to Jerusalem for Shabbat in a long time. And I got a phone call from a group of lone soldiers. Many soldiers, they get the weekend, they get Shabbat off. Now, it's a very big deal getting Shabbat off in the Israeli army. You go home for Shabbat. You go home for the weekend. But if you're a lone soldier, you have nowhere to go because your family's not there. And so there's little organizations, and a friend of mine, an old student of mine, has an organization in Jerusalem called Chayal Chayal. And he and his wife lovingly care for lone soldiers, American, Canadian, South African, Australian, Jewish kids from all over the world who go and voluntarily, because it's not mandatory for Israelis, it's mandatory. For these kids, it's voluntarily, they go to defend the Jewish homeland. And they asked me if I could come on Shabbat afternoon and visit with them and talk to them and inspire them. Thinking to myself, what am I going to be inspired? I mean, these are heroes. To me, these are great heroes. Leaving the comfort of the United States, Canada, getting into the danger. These are people, these young people just came out of Gaza. Of course. How could I not go? And they said could come at 2:30. So around I knew it was about a 40-minute walk, and I went with a few friends. And so we left where we were staying at about 1:40, and we walk outside. A couple walks over to us immediately and said, "Did you hear the news?" "What news?" "It's Shabbat." Now, I want to just tell you about this couple. This couple, there's a huge division in Israel of secular and religious, what's called Chiloni and Haredi. I don't want to go into the details. It's a very sad division, but it's very different now. Right now, it's the division is not. A year ago, when I was there for the 75th anniversary, I could feel that division very strongly of different protests of the government and different issues. And so here's a secular couple. They're sitting in their house and they hear news. And what's their first thought? Their first thought is, oh, we're in Jerusalem. So many religious people are going to be walking in the streets and they have no idea what just happened. So they leave their house with one goal in mind, to tell people who look like they're keeping Shabbat what just happened. So they say what just happened, that just a few minutes ago, Israel bombed Gaza and killed 70 terrorists, amongst them the number 2 in command of Hamas, Muhammad Daif. If you don't know who he is, he's literally the number 2 most wanted person in Israel. Number 1 being Sinwar. His name should be erased. And there had tried to kill him, I think 7 or 8 times before. They called him the man with 9 lives. And this time they finally got him. And so there was an elation, but I don't think it was the elation that they were looking for. They were looking for something different. But again, am I a victim? Am I a perpetrator? Or am I a bystander? And so I think in this situation, I didn't feel it like an Israeli. My guttural reaction was not the Israeli reaction. And we ended up talking, and they said, where are you going? I said, we're going to be walking down Jaffa. So they walked with us down Jaffa for a little bit. Now, of course, they had a mission. So every single person they passed, they start talking about this thing. So we pass a very religious-looking man. He has a big fur hat, a shtreimel, and his talit. He's coming obviously from synagogue. And they said to him, did you hear the news? They say to him in Hebrew. He said, no. They told him. He grabs the secular man and he starts dancing with him in the middle of the street in Jerusalem. A secular man and a religious man dancing over what? Over the killing of this Hamas general. Somebody else saw the commotion of the 2 men dancing, saw the scene. It was an unbelievable scene of these 2 men walking in Jerusalem on the street and dancing, and asked what happened. And so he's told them, and they joined the dancing too. And surely enough, there was 4 or 5 people that was dancing. A group from Toronto of tourists from Toronto passed us. We told them. They started. They again, probably a similar reaction to the reaction that I had. But anytime we passed an Israeli, there was such a sense of, there was one woman, she's started praying. She went like this with her hands up in the air, praying to God. You could feel the intense emotion being on the street. There's no way. I mean, I just happened to be the scene that I was there when it happened. And they said, a lot of people said that it was a similar feeling to, they also found the 4 hostages. If you remember a few months ago, when they found the 4 hostages and they rescued, that daring rescue mission was also on Shabbat. And a lot of people heard about it in the streets because it was Shabbat. And there was a very similar feeling on the streets. Well, as we walked down Jaffa, there was this incredible feeling of elation that you felt from whether you were secular or you were religious. We also passed a couple. She was wearing a hijab. You can see very clearly they were Arab. I'm assuming if they were walking on Jaffa, they're Arab Israeli. And I said to her, you're going to tell them? I said, of course, I'm telling everybody. And that was a very interesting episode of listening to them. And I ended up getting into a conversation with them for a little while and hearing their perspective. What was interesting to me about their perspective was, she told me at the end that the only reason why they were so open and honest with us is because they knew that it was Shabbat and we had no recording device. That if we were recording it, they would not have been open and honest. If there was a thought that we were recording it. So that was interesting to me. We end up making our way towards the lone soldiers. The lone soldiers already had heard about it. They were already in great celebration mode, passing out l'chaims. They themselves, it really affected them. And you can feel the visceral feeling of what this meant. And for me, I had to keep on checking myself. Like I don't know how I felt about it. I don't like the idea of people being killed and celebrating the downfall. We says that you cannot the Talmud says you can't celebrate the downfall of your enemies. So I had a very hard time with celebrating the downfall, but also understanding what this means for these people who literally are risking their life day and night, trying to defend a country, a people, trying to end a war that they did not start and they did not want to get into in the first place. And just living during this time in Israel, there's definitely a sense of exhaustion that you could feel 9 months later from the people. What a different feeling than it was 8.5 months ago when I was there. Just exhaustion. People are just fed up. They want it done already. There's been too much loss of life. But of course, at this point, they feel like they don't want all that loss of life. And more than loss of life, I went to the hospitals and visiting how many people. It's not what's spoken about outside of Israel, but the amount of injured soldiers, the amount of injured people and lifelong injuries, losing limbs. But that was very hard going through the hospitals and seeing to what extent. I don't have an answer for you. And I know I'm reading some of your comments. I understand that that we can be all three at one time. We can be we can they can all coexist. I agree with that. I love this comment um that that the bystanders, we all fail to see each other first as humans and forget our responsibility to the world. I agree with you. And that's why it's very, very hard. And I've been grappling with this since I've gotten back and trying to think about, where does this stand? Who are we? And are we standing? Are we bystanders at the party of Kamtza and Bar-Kamtza? And so many thoughts. I want to finish off by trying to make some kind of understanding. And I'm not going to clarify it. I may make it more complicated. I want to understand the Bar-Kamtza. I want to understand the person who's going to do such a terrible thing as to go, and as a result of their actions, even in their rage. My mother always said, you don't do anything when you're angry. The guy who comes to the party and no one wants him there. And he starts to loudly argue. And when he's politely asked to step out, every one of us would leave immediately. They would even get a sense of not being wanted at the party. If you're not wanted, if you don't want me, I don't want to be there either. But that guy, that Bar-Kamtza, who stays around and who gets on your nerves, and even if you hint to them, they don't take a hint. They need to be told straight. They don't get the hint 10 times, 20 times that they're not welcome. What's more about that person, and I'm sure you've been in these situations, no one comes to their defense. Why? Because nobody wants them at their table. Everyone's worried that if they come to their defense, this guy is going to end up sitting next to them. As a rabbi, I often have to deal with these situations. If we're having a kiddush or we're having an event, there are people who will come to me and say, can you please sit me next to this and this person? And I know that that person doesn't want to be sit, or someone will say this person's annoying me or bothering me, or this person is not being proper. I was thinking, like, has anyone ever come over to me at an event and said, "Oh yeah, that the awkward person over there, make sure he sits with me"? I don't think I've ever gotten that. What's crazy about it also, and I want to go a step further, is the Jewish people today are considered to be this annoying person. We are that. No country or state wants us at their table. Throughout much of our history, no one wanted us. And even today, there's hardly a country. We can count on one hand how many countries want to come to Israel's defense. I know it sounds quite grim, but here's how I'll end. Judaism believes that what you put into the universe is what it gives back to you. So right now, my thought is that maybe this is a message during this time. The temple was destroyed because of baseless hatred. Our job right now, because for the next 3 weeks, and it's not just 3 weeks, 3 weeks during this time after October 7th, during this very, very difficult time in the world in general, we could get caught up in the politics. I'm sure as I'm talking, you're thinking about this political thing and that political thing. We could get caught up in the noise. We could become victims. Oh, poor me, poor me. We could become perpetrators. Or we can continue to be the bystanders. Or we can do something else. We could be not any of them. We could be above it, which has always been the Jewish way. Not the perpetrator, not the victim, not the bystander. We are above it. And how do we do that? By exercising baseless love. By caring, by loving others, by caring about them just because of who they are. No other reason. They annoy you, they annoy you. They bother you, they bother you. There's one thing we can do today. Look around. Who around you, work, your family, your friends, random people in the street. I don't care if they don't respond. That's not your problem, them not responding to your good morning. But our job in this crazy world right now is to exercise baseless love. Instead of showing up at the world and expecting something to happen for you or to you, or when something happens to you, reacting, because that's what's happened. We become just reacting to everything. Instead of doing that, be proactive. Be the one who looks around the room and sees that there's someone who's alone and say hi to them. Be the one to just add a little more kindness to this world. And then my blessing to you is that in turn, God will see that that's us. We're the baseless love people. And God will finally return us to our land, to a time of peace, absolute peace, the time that we've been waiting for so long, the time that we've wished, that our grandparents and great-grandparents wished us, that we should be back in our homeland, but not just back in our homeland, back in a world that is full of peace and love, that this baseless love that you have and that each of us has should be a baseless love that just continues to grow and grow and grow and build a world that is truly, truly full of peace. I wish you all a wonderful day.